All right, welcome back, everyone, to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am Jesse Collings. I am joined, as always, with Jason Ounpraseuth, my partner to the north here. And we are joined today with a guest. We are joined by Adam Berger. Is that how you pronounce your last name, Adam? I should have asked that before we went on air.
That's all right. I get it all the time. No, it's Burger, like the food.
Oh, okay. So we're here with Adam Berger, whose name I just learned. Adam, you are the third guest in the history of the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. You are coming on the heels of Brandon Thurston and, of course, David, our casual fan. So I'm going to expect you to be like kind of in the middle between those two guys when it comes to wrestling knowledge, but just hang in there, okay?
All right, I'll do my best. I think I can. I mean, that's a pretty giant gulf, but I'll see what I can do.
Yeah, somewhere in between someone who rarely watches wrestling and Brandon. But what we're going to do today, and the reason Adam is here, is we're going to be talking a lot about talent development. And the reason Adam is on is because Adam wrote an article for voicesofwrestling.com. It's titled Stunted Development, WWE's Unsustainable Next in Line Recruitment Strategy. It was published a few months back, but really, what's funny is that almost nothing has changed from what you've written in that article, which I think is kind of interesting. But it's really taking a deep dive, looking at the kind of talent that's currently on WWE's main roster, how they've been pushed, and kind of what their background is. And it's a really interesting, kind of data-based analysis of who are these people that WWE are getting to with the idea of eventually turning them into WWE superstars, and how successful have they been through their various means of trying to train that talent and try to elevate that talent into a position of where they would be considered a success. And it's something that I think me and Jason have talked about a lot in different ways. I feel like no episode goes by almost where we talk about how NXT is a failure and the Performance Center is a failure, and they're never going to be able to develop talent like that. But Adam, you actually did a lot of legwork on this to kind of analyze what kind of talent we're seeing in NXT and kind of how that is playing out over WWE's product over the last decade or so. If you just want to talk a little bit more about kind of why you decided to do that analysis and kind of what were some of your key findings.
Yeah. Well, the reason that it kind of came to me to write about this was when NXT changed from, the black and gold to NXT 2.0. So obviously the black and gold was all the best indie wrestlers and wrestlers from Japan. So they're bringing them in and to have great matches, great feuds. They could, a lot of them could promo really well. And they would mix in, some guys and girls that were less experienced, trained like from the ground up every once in a while. Some of those people would break out. But with NXT 2.0, it's really just, it's virtually all people that are being trained from the ground up. Like they haven't done any training before, or if they have, it's pretty minimal in terms of any experience they have on the indies.
Yeah, and you look at the data that you kind of pulled up, and I think it kind of confirmed a lot of the suspicions that I think a lot of people have about it.
Yeah, it's like, so if this is their approach going forward, how successful have they been with that in the past? So I basically just started it with the creation of NXT in 2010 and just looked at, okay, who are the people who debuted on the main roster 2010 and later? And the way I said a minimum, like they had to have at least 10 matches on Raw or SmackDown, because it gets kind of hazy with like the NXT UK like specials and the 205 live stuff. So it's like, okay, like Raw and SmackDown are what generate, and the pay-per-views or premium live events, those are what generate the revenue. So who are the people that they're actually relying on to generate that revenue, and where do they come from? So that was the approach that I took. And then I try to figure out like how high or low they were pushed. It's hard to do that really. So I just used like kayfabe title reign. So did they win the world championship? Did they get some sort of single secondary championship? Or did they just win nothing or were relegated to the tag titles, which Vince McMahon doesn't care about, obviously. So after that, it was kind of like, okay, then I broke it down by, okay, were they trained by the PC or were they and trained by the PC, I said, did they have less than 50 matches on Cage Match prior to signing? Which, that could take someone a couple of years to get 50 matches on the indies. And it's possible they had far more that just weren't documented. So if they had less than 50 matches, I just said they were trained by WWE, even if, maybe they really weren't. And so, yeah, basically what I found is that, the vast majority of people that WWE pushed, both men and women, were people that they didn't train. Like the people that they've relied upon the most were ones that had the most experience before they joined WWE.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting read to get, especially the criteria you put out with the 50 matches. And, it's kind of funny that Jesse said that, like, nothing's really changed. It's more like WWE more doubled down on their approach. They've recently announced an expansion of the NIL program, as they're calling it, next in line. And, they're pretty committed to all these athletes who have very little wrestling experience. For some of them, maybe a professional career isn't in their sights, and so they think WWE is a method for them. So I'm kind of curious on what was there sort of a pattern you saw in some of these for the WWE trained people, as you mentioned? Was there like a common trend of like their backgrounds of whatever sport they came from, or whatever?
So in terms of success, the most interesting pattern that I noticed was the most successful, both from a push standpoint and really from like, I didn't really do anything with in-ring quality, and talent, because that's subjective, but just, making those observations on my own. The most interesting thing I saw was that the most successful people who were trained by the PC were all second generation talent. You have the Usos, Roman Reigns, Charlotte Flair, as a couple examples. So Bray Wyatt, another one who was really successful. So it's like, okay, those people like actually did relatively well. And obviously there's some second generation talent that didn't, like, Curtis Axel, Bo Dallas. But that was interesting. It's like, oh, like if someone's second generation and then they train at the PC, okay, that's actually, that might work out pretty well. But otherwise, it's pretty slim in terms of people that are really like headliners. I think the only men, I just pulled it up here to remind myself, but the only men that really like made it to the top that weren't second generation or anything were Big E and Braun Strowman. And keep in mind that on the male side anyway, and keep in mind that since 2010, people debuting on the main roster. So they had those two guys that hit and to relative success, but at least they put the top title on them. But yeah, that's two guys since 2010 that weren't second generation, and that I feel like that's more indicative of kind of the struggles that they might have with this next in line program, because the people that they're recruiting, only so many of them are going to be second generation people.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like right now in NXT, you have like, of course, the main champion right now is Braun Breaker, who is a second generation star himself. But it does seem like there's a common trend of basketball players being recruited to not even just like WWE, but just like wrestling in general. Like obviously AEW has Satnam Singh over there, but yeah, like they have Lash Legend right now, who they seem to be there's a lot of hype around her. She's very athletic and all that there. But yeah, like it does seem like the athlete is the big focus for them. And it also is a trouble when you have these athletes who have very little wrestling experience, but also on national TV. I'm curious in your impressions, like, do you think that like that is helping them, putting them out into the fray that in that manner, or is that actually a detriment to really just expose them in a national audience, even though NXT's ratings are, they aren't really that high, but still, it is still a USA network.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, if you listen to wrestlers talk about it, they're really glad their early matches weren't televised and aren't available to be seen anywhere. But then, with AEW, you see like, Jade Cargill, who's, more of an exception. She's done relatively well and has improved quite a bit. So I think the approach in general is it's kind of unfair to the unfortunately like these new recruits to have really little training and little experience and having their first matches thrown out there. And I mean, having a failed first impression is a big deal. I mean, that's what kind of sunk Drew McIntyre, like with his initial run. You know, he wasn't ready for that push that he got. He got rejected, ended up in, you know, kind of like a job squad level team and had to leave and then prove himself outside. And then they brought him back and, you know, now he's, you know, one of their top stars. So I think it's kind of unfortunate. Like if someone like Braun Breaker, like him, again, he's kind of an exception too, but like, okay, it's going to help him. I think because people might be invested with him since they've watched him since the beginning and he hasn't like embarrassed himself. And they've portrayed him pretty well. So like if it's someone that they're actually going to push and they're gifted enough to like look okay, that might lead to the audience rejecting them and becoming disinterested.
Yeah, for me, you know, one of the really interesting things about what you guys just talked about in the sense of first impressions, and I do think we're in an era with WWE where that first impression, especially on the main roster, so important because people, I think, make their judgments very quickly on who they're going to get behind and who they can see as a star. And Vince certainly does as well. And the era of like Bret Hart being this mid-card guy and working his way up to the main event scene over a decade, that's long gone. Or Shawn Michaels, or even someone like John Cena, who kind of comes in as a project and after a few years kind of finds his charisma and finds an act that gets over, and then he's elevated to a top status. That doesn't happen anymore. WWE's booking patterns aren't consistent enough to kind of reliably do that. It always seems like you're going to come in and you're going to get pushed, and you're going to get pushed as a really big deal right away. You look at like even someone like Roman Reigns, who one could argue kind of came in and was slowly pushed upwards. But when he came in, he was immediately like, this is a top act. They're never going to lose. They're never going to be in like a mid-card like feud. It's going to be a thing. He can be kind of hidden in the shield with these other guys, but he was always presented as a top star or a potential top star. And this kind of slow climb upwards where I think wrestlers can benefit from finding something that helps them get over and gain experience in the ring if they don't have that much of it. And certainly people like John Cena or Dave Bautista, these guys certainly benefited, you know, not having as much ring experience, but kind of being in the mid card and working their way up to being acceptable enough before they got into the main event. It now seems like if they bring in Braun Breaker, if they bring that guy up to the main roster, he's gonna have to win the Royal Rumble, like his first in his debut, or like immediately be in a world title feud, because I don't really believe that they can take him and they can make him like kind of like over several years elevate him to the level where he's now got like 5 or 6 years in the business and has reached kind of a good baseline for a main event star. I think he's got to be going right away, because I don't think the fans, nor do I think Vince, are going to have the patience to kind of wait on somebody to become a star again. I think that the way that environment is now is you have to come up and you have to be a big deal, or else we're not going to care about you. And the reason people feel that way is because that's what happens. Is if someone comes up, you know almost immediately if they're going to be a big star or not, or if Vince is going to push them as a big star or not. And that's just one of those things that's like, I'm high on Montez Ford, right? He's a PC trained guy. I would say he's definitely one of the better PC recruits, both in the ring and certainly from a charisma standpoint. And people are saying, oh, they should push him as a top star and maybe he'll get this big push. And it's like, you know, he's been in a tag team for years. We know how Vince feels about tag teams. I think Vince sees him not as a top star. And I think he's kind of found this hole for himself where he's on television, but people don't see him as a top star. And it's been years since he debuted. And I just think at this point, if they really believed in him, he'd be elevated, and he's going to end up kind of being stuck as this mid-card guy. And even if they eventually do push him as a top star, people won't buy it. We saw that with their attempts to kind of make Kofi Kingston and Dolph Ziggler kind of in previous eras into stars after years of keeping them in the mid card. People were just taught to think that they're mid carders, and just they didn't gravitate towards them in a meaningful way. And I just think that whole process is kind of lost. And I don't know if WWE understands that with their booking. I think they don't, because if they did, it wouldn't be happening. But I think that you can't just have this era of this idealized version of how to bring people along, which I think is what a lot of people think of when they think of talent development and kind of how to create a new star. It just doesn't seem like it exists in a reality right now.
Yeah, there's been a couple guys that it seemed like they were slotted at a certain level, and then they were able to rise above that and become top acts. But there are people who had a lot of experience. Like when AJ Styles came in, it didn't really, it seemed like he was more like, upper mid card type guy. They weren't necessarily going to make him a main eventer. And then they did, because, he was just, Bryan Danielson, they fired him because they didn't really see that. I know they brought him back, but he was feuding with The Miz for a long time after that. And then he got hot, and even with Kofi, like Kofi did get hot, and people were really invested in him for a while. But obviously, with the way that push kind of ended, and then he was right back to where he was before, it was pretty clear that Vince and top management didn't really believe in him, even though he did get some pretty strong reactions for a while. So yeah, I think the problem is, it's really just that they don't, like, the mid card doesn't really mean anything anymore. So it's just they book people 50-50 for a long period of time, and then obviously at that point the fans have just kind of given up on them ever being elevated. So then if they do decide to elevate them, I don't know if it necessarily can't work, but I just think the talent themselves just has to be so great, like someone like AJ Styles or Bryan Danielson, to where, okay, like it doesn't, like their past doesn't matter because they're just so great. And if someone's being trained from the ground up in the PC, they're not going to have that same level of experience, even if maybe they have that same level of potential.
Yeah, sort of taking a look at your sort of tier 2 list of like the trained WWE guys. I mean, that's just like a perfect example of that. Like you have guys like, like a Wade Barrett, who like, his potential was just out of, like, had no ceiling, but seemingly when the Nexus debuted. Like he was obviously positioned as the main guy, but they just never pulled the trigger on him. They just had him lose to John Cena and Randy Orton, the established guys. And, he did, get some mid-card titles. But as you said, the mid-carders really matter, as similar with Curtis Axel. They tried, putting Paul Heyman on him, and they put the Intercontinental title on him. But even him, they just had a ceiling for him in terms of where they saw him.
Yeah, I mean, the other guys in that tier, Miro and Ryback too, like started off really hot, and then for whatever reason they lost interest. And obviously, Miro and Ryback aren't Bryan Danielson or AJ Styles, but I mean, they could have been used similarly to the way they used Braun Strowman, and even Big E, and even they could have been used better as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we're talking about talent development and kind of elevating them into successful stars, there are a bunch of different variables that we're talking about. I think with those guys that you guys just mentioned, we're talking about people that WWE did succeed in at least developing them into talented, entertaining performers. People like Wade Barrett and people like Miro. But creatively, the function wasn't there. And I think, and that's one thing, but then there's this other element where they train these people and they just don't understand. They don't have the skills that kind of develop into being a star. If that makes, I'm doing a kind of a bad job of wording that out, but it's the idea of like, we have people, it's easy to understand someone like Miro, who I think we all can see is very, very talented, who was over at one point, who kind of lost his push for a variety of stupid reasons and is now no longer in the company. But it's harder to kind of look at what I consider the main problem, which is that so many of these people that WWE hires and trains all have physical potential, because a lot of these guys, you know, we talk about the football players, the amateur wrestlers, or the track athletes, but they just don't have the skills or charisma to be actually exciting as individual performers. And it's not necessarily a creative issue as much as it is a talent development issue and a talents and a skill teaching issue. And I do wonder, like, are we shifting more towards that being the main problem, as opposed to, I think in the past, creative being the main problem?
Yeah. Well, with the column that I put together, I only, in order to be listed, you had to have 10 matches on either Raw or SmackDown. There are so many people that go through that system that don't, not even do they not get to 10. I mean, Killer Cross didn't get to 10 matches. So like, he's not even on the list, but like even that, at least he had like, you know, this NXT run and got like an audition on the main roster. There's people that don't even make like NXT TV.
Yeah, they're names that we haven't heard of before.
Exactly.
There's a photo of them somewhere wearing the property of the, you know, Performance Center shirt, and that's all anyone ever saw of them.
Yeah, and I think that's part of. And here's the thing: like some of that has to do with obviously to become a good wrestler. A lot of it is just experience and getting reps, having matches, working in front of live crowds, working with people that are more experienced than you, who can help teach you. And when you're just working with people that are your same level of experience and you're only having like a couple matches a month that are on TV, by the way, so they're probably a lot shorter than matches that you could theoretically have in front of, you know, at a house show in front of a live audience, you're just not going to develop at the same rate, or really maybe even at all. So, I mean, that just adds to what's already kind of anyone who trains wrestling, like trains to become a wrestler, they're probably not going to be any good. Even like just the vast majority of people who train to be a pro wrestler are probably just going to be awful and never make it. So even if they're, you know, they're high quality athletes, but then when you add on those systemic issues of, you know, not working regularly enough, not working with people better than you, it just decreases your chances of success that much more.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you have, you know, I think, yeah, some of the holdovers from the old black and gold era, like, you know, the Indy Hartwell, for example, like, you know, she is still young. I think she's like 23. And so she has, you know, a chance to develop, but still, like, as you mentioned, like she's developing with the newer talents who are also developing as well. So it's really hard to tell, like, whether like she actually has potential or not, or whether, you know, this is actually just the level that she's at right now. Obviously her, I think it was like a week ago or 2 weeks ago, they had an infamously botched match with Flash Legend, which was pretty messy, and it didn't really make her, it didn't make anyone look good. But it kind of goes to your, what you're saying, Adam, is that, like, you know, they are just working with a very similar skill level, and going into what Jesse's saying, you know, maybe the training, you know, is kind of part of that. Like they're really just trained to you know, choreograph matches, and, you know, really in a way that isn't indicative to the WWE style. Like they're not really being trained the way for the main roster. They're just being trained to do what they're doing on NXT, and they're not really being prepared for the main roster.
To me, I think watching some of this NXT 2.0. So like Adam mentioned, we're going through a big change from the black and gold era of NXT, where NXT was, you know, had so much individual in-ring talent, right? They were really going out and signing some of the best wrestlers in the world to come and work there. And it set kind of a tone for what people do expect out of NXT. And also, as you mentioned, Jason, provided a lot of experienced people for newer talent to work with and makes them look better. And I think anyone that teaches wrestling will tell you the best way to get better is to work with people who are very, very good. So they go through what is essentially a really radical, you know, philosophy change NXT, you know, when Triple H was removed from power essentially, and or he had to step down from his position, and you're led to, you know, we're going to go super inexperienced, super young, goodbye 15-year indie veterans, goodbye wrestlers from Japan. There's still some sticking around. You have your Roderick Strongs and your Sarays, but for the most part, you're just going full on performance center recruits, people with, under 20 career matches. Let's put them out on television. Let's see what we can do. And it really raises a lot of questions, I think, about their long-term talent development. And the bigger question that I have is the philosophical idea of getting rid of any form of like independent wrestling knowledge or knowledge of people who were trained outside of the performance center, and really hammering home the idea of the WWE system of talent development, which is we're going to recruit the person who is at least this tall, who has a body that looks like this, who played this college sport, and we're going to teach them the WWE fundamentals of how to look at the hard cam and how to, make faces and how to do our WWE style promos. And it's so sterile and weird and frankly bizarre that wrestling, which is an art form, would want to be the best way to develop that is to create this pattern where everyone kind of looks the same and acts the same way and works the same style, because there's some sort of massive amount of faith put into this WWE system as the only way to train talent ready to appear on WWE television.
Yeah, I think a lot. Well, obviously that comes, it's the tone at the top with Vince McMahon. He doesn't want, he's notorious for, he'll only do things if he can convince himself he came up with the idea. Like he'll always want to like tinker with someone's act or repackage them in some way. And he's obviously a control freak and wants control over everything. So in his mind, I think he just thinks, okay, I just need people to do what I want them to do, and then we'll be successful. But wrestling it's not a writer's medium where you can just cast actors and have them go out and say the lines like, some sort of WB show or soap opera or something like that. It's more like, I always look at it, it's more like stand-up comedy. Like these are, like the improvisation is so important, and coming up with your own unique character and style and being able to convey that to the audience. And that's something that only develops with time and experience. So taking people that just have no experience and telling them exactly what to say and exactly what to do, even if they're able to have more matches, they're not necessarily gaining a skill level. They might be gaining some level of competency, but they're not developing the skills that they'll need to, go out and have like a 20 or 30 minute main event match. You can't necessarily just memorize. I mean, I'm sure people can, but it's a lot harder to memorize that move for move and have it like succeed the way that you want to, as opposed to like, okay, we have an outline for what we're going to do. We'll see how the crowd reacts. Then we can go in this direction or this direction. But if you're just programming people like robots from day one of training, they're never going to develop that skill set to adapt and digest on the fly.
Yeah, I mean, all they're really learning is just how to memorize stuff, and like that's not pro wrestling. Like sometimes can be. You obviously have planned out spots at times, but like it's not like you said, a move kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm not an anti-planning person who's like, oh, real wrestling, you have to call it in the ring, brother. It's like Randy Savage was awesome and he planned stuff up. Honestly, ultimately, like we're the audience, we don't care how they do it. Like if they plan everything out and it's great, then hey, by all means do that. But in general, like you need to be able to kind of merge the two. You like obviously you want to put thought and effort into planning your match. So because it's a lot harder to just come up with everything. Put some thought and effort into it. Don't just be lazy and try to improvise the whole thing. But sometimes things happen and you have to adapt. So like in that match you were talking about, the Indy Hartwell / Legend match, I mean, I guess they adapted in terms of getting the finish, but it wasn't, wasn't very pretty the way they did it.
I think when it comes to like talent development, skill development, I think a lot of people will look at in-ring work and they'll say, oh, these guys stink in the ring, or these women stink in the ring, and they're not as good as the people who were on the indies and that kind of thing in the old era of NXT or whoever they're calling up to the main roster. And I think there's some truth to that. But when I think about like the real problematic stuff with the kind of philosophy and the kind of skills that they're teaching, their talent that they develop themselves is in the charisma department. And when it comes to like projecting in a way that allows you not only to have like a main event match for 20 minutes, like you said, Adam, but to get over with an audience. And a lot of it is like, I was watching the Madcap Moss Baron Corbin match. I want to say it was from Extreme Rules. It was from a couple of months ago. And if you watch the match, it's not like those guys are bad in the ring. It's not like they're botching moves or they're doing stuff that's not hitting. Like the guy, they're out there, they look like athletes, they're moving fine. All of their offense looks good. Someone's selling, like all of that stuff fundamentally is fine. But when I was watching it, I was just thinking, these are two guys who are so boring in a way that is totally unique to like WWE Performance Center trainees, is that there's no projection of charisma. There's no investment from the crowd. No one's building towards a comeback really that people care about. Part of it is the characters on screen suck. So like no one's going to get behind them anyway, but just the work feels so boring and unenthusiastic. And part of it is because we see so many people in WWE wrestle that style that everything just seems very gray and static and very dry. I mean, I was watching I want to say it was Brooks Jensen match on NXT 2.0. And I forget who he's wrestling. I think, he was wrestling Tony D'Angelo, right? So two Performance Center guys. And, they're going through the paces and Brooke Jensen throws him into the ropes and, he rears back and he gives Tony D'Angelo a clothesline, and the clothesline looks good. And then he stands up and he looks and he sneers at the hard camera. And I was watching it and I'm like, you know what? I bet you WWE, executives, whether it's Shawn Michaels or Vince McMahon or John Laurinaitis or Paul Levesque, whoever's in charge of this thing, I bet you they're watching backstage and they're like, yeah, that's good. That's how you wrestle. That's quality work. And when I watched it, I was like, this guy's just another one of these gray blobs. It's exactly how WWE would teach someone to do something. It's throw them off the ropes and the clothesline and look into the hard camera. And fundamentally, there's nothing wrong with any of those things. It's a totally fine way for someone to be a performer. But the issue becomes everyone wrestles like that. So no one stands out. No one's unique. It becomes really redundant and boring to watch all of these people wrestle the exact same way. And to me, it's just like, this is going to be just that one spot. I was like, 2.0 is going to fail. It's not going to work. All of these people are going to be flop on the main roster because they don't have any form of unique individuality. They have an individuality in the way that like Vince McMahon can project individuality on someone by giving them a wacky gimmick and telling them, oh, you're doing this now. Cora Jade, you're a skateboarder, and Tony D'Angelo, you're in the mafia. Like they have all these very like superficial gimmicks to kind of create artificial individuality, but they don't, when they get in the ring, they all feel exactly the same. And it's just totally different than any other version of successful wrestling that I have seen. And it's just not going to work. And that is what gives me bigger pause when it comes to looking down the line of like, we're going to get rid of all of the independent wrestlers. Everyone that we come up with is going to come up through this system. So they're going to work this exact same way. And it's like, it's not going to work. None of these people are going to be interesting. Maybe you'll get someone who's just super talented and they'll break the mold and it'll work. But just the day in and day out talent that you have down there, all being taught the exact same thing and being taught to perform the exact same way, it's going to create an incredibly boring wrestling product.
Yeah, I mean, you just said it. Like, if everybody works the same way, then nobody's unique. And it's not just character isn't just conveyed to the audience via promos. Like, if you think about, like, yeah, the Legion of Doom, the Road Warriors, like, yeah, they were badasses I mean, in part because of their promos, but they also just like no sold everyone and did press slams on. It doesn't matter how they press slammed with Hogan, so they didn't care how big someone was, and that was unique to them because they could wrestle that way, and the audience would buy it. Like, you know, teaching like Baron Corbin to work the same way as, you know, someone who's 6 inches shorter and 50 pounds lighter than him. That's not good because, you know, then it doesn't make Baron Corbin seem particularly big in the way that he works. And it doesn't make the smaller guys seem, you know, particularly skilled the way he works if, you know, everything he does, like someone who's bigger than him does the exact same thing. And then it also doesn't reinforce their personalities at all with the way they're working. If it's like, and so that's the thing, like, you know, wrestlers who work in different places, they're developing their in-ring skill set at the same time they're developing their characters. And then, you know, those two kind of, and that's when wrestlers become really good and stand out. It's when there's kind of a marriage between their in-ring skill set and their gimmick that makes them unique and like, oh, that's why they're who they are and they're not like anybody else. Like one extreme example is obviously Mick Foley. Like nobody else worked like Mick Foley or had a character like Mick Foley. And that was something he developed over time, you know, working in different places. So, and that's the thing. It's obviously, Dominic DeNucci didn't teach Mick Foley to do everything that Mick Foley did. He had to pick up a lot of different things and then figure out what worked for him. And so just kind of programming everyone like robots to work the exact same way, they're not doing any of that. And so that's just going to result in, like you said, Jesse, like no one standing out and everyone just seeming the same.
Yeah, it does make me worried that there will be a sort of, I guess, sacrificial lamb, for lack of a better term, like as in they're going to call up an NXT 2.0 star and they are going to attempt to push them to a moderate level and it's going to blow up in their face. And I don't know whether it's going to be one person that's going to cause a big shift in this development, since they do seem to be committed in this NIL sort of program, but still it does feel like it could take a couple misses for them to actually blow this all up. I don't know, Adam, in your research, I mean, is there a way that you think this could all sort of change in a dramatic direction for this NIL sort of era that WWE's in, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, this can either go, there's so many different factors that can change like how this is going to turn out. Obviously, the primary one is Vince McMahon running the company or not? So that's the first one, because let's say, you know, with all the accusations that he has, and maybe he does step aside from day-to-day operations, maybe they sell the company at some point and someone else is in charge. Like, obviously, we know Triple H, if he's in charge, he's going to have a different approach. And I think with NXT, the black and gold, he leaned maybe more indie than he would on the main roster, just because, you know, they made him look really good in terms of drawing NBA size arenas for the takeovers right away. Just kind of a shortcut versus developing a bunch of guys on your own. So with the main roster, he might be a little bit more blended, but he's still gonna, you know, he would put Adam Cole on the main roster and promote Adam Cole as a top star, like if he were in charge, as an example. But if Vince does remain in charge and he keeps this policy up, I think eventually, and I brought this up in my column, there's a lot of stars over 40 that they have that are going to age out and they're going to need to replace them. And I think what's going to eventually happen is, as that happens, if the Ridge Hollands of the world aren't able to deliver, they're going to look for talent that's already established elsewhere. And that's where they're going to get their new main roster stars if NXT isn't able to supply them. So, you know, we obviously saw Cody move over to WWE from AEW and got pushed like, I mean, I wrote a column the day Cody left AEW and was like, I think this could work out really well for him. And, you know, obviously it's not, we don't know for sure yet, but it seems like it's going to. So, and obviously there's the MJF rumors as well. So if Vince remains in charge, I think eventually that's probably what's going to happen is some of the guys from NXT 2.0 just won't work the way they want them to. And then they'll just pay to get people from AEW back. And it's probably like, I can't envision Vince like being like, oh yeah, I want Darby Allin. But I could see Vince being like, okay, Cody, MJF, yeah, we'll offer a bunch of money for Malachi Black to come back or Keith Lee to come back or Swerve maybe. I could see people that he already liked to some degree and just it didn't work the first time. Or Miro, like bringing a bunch of those guys back, just because they can outbid anyone if they really want to. So if Vince remains in power and NXT 2.0 continues, I think eventually that's what we'll see in terms of the talent that will make up the main roster.
We've seen how we got to this point with NXT 2.0 in the first place, which was Vince being frustrated by the talent that he had at his hands. That's ultimately what it was about, was Vince being like, I don't have anyone I feel like I want to push. And the reason I don't have that in his mind is Triple H and NXT is have all these guys who are over who I don't like. And it's Johnny Gargano and it's Adam Cole and it's Kyle O'Reilly and it's Tommaso Ciampa. And it's these small guys that I don't view as stars because I have a very narrow view on who can be a star. And so we're going to get rid of all this. Triple H is going to be fired. We're going to either let these guys' contracts expire or we're going to release them. And we're going to rebuild with people that I like, which are big ex-football players. And that's exactly what they've done. And now, so we as fans are going to see, it's easy for us to project what the next step is, which is, as you described, Adam, which is these guys not being good enough, even if they look the part for Vince. Because there are plenty of people who look the part for Vince that Vince immediately gets excited about and then stops pushing them right away when it turns out they kind of stink. This is the Tom McGee story all over again, which is like, this guy looks the part, I'm going to put, he's the net. He called Tom McGee. For people who don't know, Tom McGee was a wrestler in the 80s who had a famous match with Bret Hart, which Bret Hart apparently made Tom McGee look so good that after the match, Vince McMahon said, that's going to be my next Hulk Hogan. And then I think like within a year, Tom McGee was no longer with the company because it turned out that Tom McGee actually stunk and Bret Hart was just carrying him the entire time. And it would take years for Vince to realize that Bret Hart was the guy he should have pushed as his top star. But the idea is Vince is going to see these guys he might like the way that, Braun Breaker or the Creed brothers or, Duke Hudson or whoever, pick your take person from NXT. He might like the way they look, but he's going to get them and he's going to be like, actually, I don't like you because you stink. I need something else. And then they're going to reset again, I think. And I think maybe they might, I don't know if they'll go full blown, like we need to just raid the indies again and restock NXT with all these talent. But I do think we'll see a shift again. And I think, Adam, you're right that they're going to look at AEW's roster and be like, yeah, let's get those guys, especially guys that they can get back, because in their minds, like Cody, it's like, we made you. Like someone like Miro, I feel like Vince would actually be like, yeah, Miro's actually our development. He's my creation, not theirs. They stole him from me, which is actually what Vince's personality would tell him, which is these guys, they just took the talent that I made into stars, because that's what he felt like about WCW, was that WCW just took the talent that he made into stars and used them to run against him. And I'm sure he feels the same way about a lot of the talent in AEW. And those will be the people that the WWE will be relying on. I also think that WWE will be relying on celebrities to come in. I mean, that's kind of what we're already seeing, where the top of WWE's main roster is really weak when it comes to people that can actually draw. So we're seeing an increasing reliance, not only on the part-time, your Brock Lesnar type wrestlers, but we're also seeing a reliance on your Logan Paul type wrestlers and Bad Bunny, Pat McAfee, and these people with celebrity kind of profiles coming in, and they're kind of being counted on now to be your top drawing acts, because just don't have that on the main roster. And the idea would be that's unsustainable to keep relying on various celebrities to pop ratings and to drive business forward. But I don't know, maybe it's not. It's kind of like a crazy strategy that we've never really seen anyone really try before.
Yeah, definitely. Pat McAfee feels like a double-edged sword for WWE, because he's legitimately, because he's not, trained in that WWE style. He's, very charismatic, and people genuinely like Pat McAfee. and he's pretty decent in the ring, but at the same time, like you said, Jesse, this is an unsustainable model to really rely on celebrities all the time, and especially because most of them aren't really that great. They really need to be carried in the ring by your already experienced stars who, like you said, Adam, they already have a bunch of over 40 stars they need to replace. And so those people aren't going to be there for all the time to help out your celebrities. And so, it's an interesting dichotomy there of Pat McAfee, specifically for him, because he is always on SmackDown. He's has a very popular podcast, but still he's not going to be around all the time to do matches, since that's probably not what he's most interested in.
Yeah, Pat McAfee is such a celebrity involvement's interesting in general, but Pat McAfee is such an outlier because he's obviously like a wrestling super fan.
Yeah.
If he wasn't an NFL player, maybe he would have gotten into wrestling before that. But he also has a lot of freedom because he was an NFL player. He's already rich. He has his successful podcast. Like if he does something that Vince McMahon doesn't like and Vince McMahon fires him tomorrow, he doesn't care. So that gives him a lot of freedom to take chances creatively, both, with his commentary, with his actual matches, with his segments. He's not worried about getting fired because he has a career outside of that. A lot of these like trainees that we were talking about, they don't have that. Like this, they're terrified. They're walking on eggshells. So when they get told to do something a specific way, they're going to do something only that specific way and not, experiment. It's weird. I actually told Jesse this. I don't think Jesse believed me, but I'm like, maybe they should do Pat McAfee against Logan Paul for WrestleMania. Like, if they can't get The Rock, like, is that actually the biggest match that they have? I think it might be. Honestly, as crazy as that sounds,
there's definitely something to be studied about why a commentator, podcast host, ex-football player is way more charismatic and interesting to the WWE audience. I actually think Pat kind of stinks, but like I find his personality very grating, but he's really over to the WWE audience in a way that none of their like actual wrestlers are. That was kind of like a big thing at WrestleMania where I was like, Pat McAfee is the biggest babyface in the company when he had his match with Theory. Like the crowd was so into him compared to everyone else on that show. And I was like, they have something with Pat. I'm surprised he hasn't wrestled since then. I guess they're kind of saving him for big events. But to me, I was like, Pat's the most organically over person that they've had in a really long time. And I think that it's kind of telling that it's a guy who, like Adam said, he has a lot of leeway because we believe he has a lot of leeway because he has outside interests and he doesn't need the job the way that other people do. But I just think he's given way more freedom because I think he's a commentator and he's like kind of a color commentary, funny guy that Vince kind of likes, as opposed to being this wrestler who's been micromanaged to learn this very one specific style and the one way to present yourself as a star.
Well, part of that goes to what I was saying before. Pat McAfee, he's not playing some character that was thought up by Vince McMahon. Pat McAfee is Pat McAfee. So he is himself, and it's consistent with how he is like everywhere. Like I agree his commentating style is kind of grating and over the top, but if you've watched him on anything, he's over the top and can be kind of grating if you listen to him for too long. But so basically he's himself. And so he's the person who came up with this character, which is really just him. So I think that's why you used a word there that's organic. Pat McAfee feels very organic because he's being himself. And when you're training guys from the ground up and telling them who their characters are, when they don't have a lot of agency in that or in developing that, they're not going to feel as organic. The audience can sense that. And I think that is why a lot of them, like you were using terms like charisma and projection, and like that's why, because they're not sure who they're supposed to be instead of just being some version of themselves.
Yeah, I am curious whether how much that actually changes if Vince McMahon leaves the company, whether it is because of his allegations or through other outside sort of thing there, like because obviously like people are afraid of Vince, and he's the one that's issues out these mandates and says this is your character, this is what you have to say and all that. And if you stray one word away from the script, you're kind of just on this shit list. And, you know, how much does that change if someone like Triple H is in charge? Seemingly from people who have worked under Triple H, you know, he does seem like it's a very similar approach with the WWE style, but he does seem to give people a little bit more freedom in some cases, at least, you know, for the Adam Coles of the world. Obviously, you know, they do stand on a higher level than the developmental stars, but I don't know whether that would be a top-down approach for someone like Triple H or whoever else takes over the company after Vince. But that is something that I would be interested in seeing, like how much that approach changes and that whole walk-in eggshells approach.
Jeff Jarrett, that's who I hope Jeff Jarrett takes over.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be interesting.
Yeah, and it's really unclear. We don't know the scope of, like, I've always been the impression that, like, if something were to happen to Vince, and let's just say that there are people out there, whether it's Triple H, whether it's Bruce Pritchard or John Laurinaitis, who's probably not going to be at the moment, but these people who are in like Vince's kind of inner circle, or what we believe to be Vince's inner circle, like how much is their wrestling knowledge and wrestling view really colored by Vince McMahon? How much of the WWE brainworms do those people possess? And that's a real question to me. And Stephanie McMahon, if she's running the company, you know, like that's another question, is like these people who have spent basically their entire lives learning wrestling from Vince McMahon, I kind of hesitate to think that they're going to have a radically different view of pro wrestling than Vince McMahon. I think the big problem with Vince is the inconsistencies in his vision, forcing a lot of changes. That coupled with a stubbornness and a refusal to ever admit that he's wrong, which is kind of really interesting. Two things where he's constantly changing his mind, but also never thinks he's wrong. So no one challenges him, even though he constantly challenges himself. But it's one of those things where it's like, so we don't really know what the vision is going to look like. And I obviously, like NXT, the black and gold version of NXT was an indicator in some ways, but like Jason said, I don't know if it's going to be a top-down approach. I think some of the NXT ideas were viewed as necessity, which is like, if we want to draw, we're going to have to go out and bring in star power. I think if Triple H suddenly starts taking over the main roster and he kind of has established star power, is he still going to be like, yeah, we got to sign these indie guys and push them, like when he has, you know, Roman Reigns and Brock Lesnar at his disposal? I don't know. I'll tell you this, nothing about Triple H's professional wrestling career would give off the idea that he was going to become this person that absolutely loved independent wrestling and wanted to present it to the masses. And so how much of that stuff in NXT was real and how much of it was out of necessity? Because I'd be really interested to know the answer to that.
Oh, I think it was entirely out of necessity. But by the same token, if, like as we were saying, if all the current stars that they have age out, then, and he has to start pushing people from NXT, and, you know, he's got Ridge Holland and Tony D'Angelo and, you know, some of the other guys like that, then he's going to have another necessity. And so obviously, you know, he could see how the reactions that the people he knew in NXT got. So, you know, and again, it's not going to be everyone, obviously, like, and I think he does have a preference, I think, for more of the traditional WWE style and big man and bodybuilder physique type things. But I'll just say, I think he's more open-minded. So if he sees, like, you know, Adam Cole getting over an AEW or someone like Adam Cole, like the Next Generation, I don't think he would hesitate to at least bring them in and give them an opportunity. Obviously, he would probably prefer to, you know, hire and push the next Braun Strowman. I don't think that's going to change at all, but I think he will be more open-minded. Like, based on the way, what he saw Adam Cole do, if he was in charge, I don't think there's any chance he'd be like, oh yeah, you're a manager now. Like, I don't think he would do that. Maybe it would only be like, all right, you're probably only going to get the US title and maybe be a rotational main event guy. But even that, like, I mean, that's a huge upgrade over like the way Vince treats these people, or those types of talent.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you have it would be an interesting 180 of sort of, you know, like Jesse mentioned, like Vince had all these talents on his roster, but then he cut them for one reason, he didn't really believe in them, but also, there was a corporate bottom line as well to really just, increase your profits every quarter. How much, these talent were costing them is, questionable. Also with the budget cuts, the alleged budget cuts reasons, but still, WWE is a corporate entity, and they have their shareholders to answer to, and so it would be interesting 180 if Triple H took over and just started, spending all the money that they had, all this time just to re-sign in, Adam Cole's or even just any other big star on outside WWE. It would be an interesting 180 if that actually happened.
I wanted to maybe change gears a little bit while we have a little bit of time left here to just kind of talk about some other wrestling promotions and their kind of talent development strategy. Obviously, AEW doesn't have a performance center like WWE, and as a new company, hasn't really had a need to develop its own talent because it's so focused on getting their promotion off the ground using whether that's WWE names or names that were known prior before AEW, like the Elite company, people from Japan, people from the independents. We have seen very few AEW rookies and trainees and that kind of thing. But at the same time, the company still needs to develop talent. And I think a lot of people would point to Jade Cargill. You could also point to Hook as kind of wrestlers who have started out since AEW started and have, I don't even really want to compare Hook and Jade Cargill because I think they're totally different people as far as how they've gotten over with the fan base. But it's very much a interesting company in the sense of that in the long term, they are going to have to develop talent, maybe not from scratch, but certainly at a greener state than maybe they were previously. They're not just going to be able to bring in, Adam Cole, ready-made star, because he came, he was around the independents for 10 years and got to spend time on national television in WWE and then was able to come up. They're maybe going to have to sign people at a more fertile stage of their wrestling careers. And how are they going to move people along and kind of what have we seen so far? I know, Adam, you've been thinking about kind of how is AEW going to get more talent and how are they going to develop it forward? What do you think about their like long-term plans and ability to develop talent, what we've seen so far?
Yeah, AEW, well, I guess to start with, AEW is a lot different than WWE in their mindsets. They view themselves as pro wrestling. So I think their approach to talent development is going to be a little bit more old school and operate a little bit more like a territory, because WWE was of the belief that we have to train people to work because we don't like the way people learn to work outside here. So AEW isn't going to be like that. They, everyone there has some honestly, like when I was looking, I'm working on a new piece right now. And one of the things that I noticed was like, okay, from the WWE talent, like former WWE talent that AEW has, how many of them were actually trained in WWE? And it's only I think it's like Miro and Jake Hager on the men's side, and then like Ty Conti and Marina Shafir on the women's, it's not many. So pretty much everyone that they have was developed either some combination of the Indies, Japan, maybe they worked in TNA and Ring of Honor. So I think their approach, I think we're already kind of seeing their approach. They'll have some special projects for physical profile people or second generation, like Brock Anderson, Hook, Jade Cargill and Satnam Singh are like the physical exceptions where okay, we'll invest some time and money into these people just because they don't come around very often. But actually, I think one approach that you'll probably see more, and this is just me speculating, but I think Nick Wayne is an interesting study case in that they identified him really early as wow, this guy has a ton of potential. He's going to be really good. Obviously, he's not 18 yet, so he can't work here, but we're going to sign him and then he's going to go work indies for a couple of years and then he'll be ready. So they're doing that out of necessity because of his age, but I could see that model working for them quite a bit. Or maybe they sign people and then obviously they're trying to add Ring of Honor television. They have their Dark and Elevation shows. Maybe those become more consistent in terms of like the younger talent that they have on those. But I could also see where, you know, they sign people and yeah, they have them work their shows, but at the same time, they're also like loaning, maybe they have like formal established relationships with maybe a Japanese company or AAA or various independents where they're sending people out to get them experience just because, you know, Tony Khan's done the math on the house show touring model and doesn't think it makes sense.
Yeah, that does seem to be what Tony Khan's approach is and why AEW hasn't really done house shows. Like he doesn't really think it's a worthy investment for them. And it's, you know, the thing they have going on with DDT right now, sort of in the reverse with Konosuke Takeshita, having him come over to AEW. Perhaps maybe that is a trial sort of thing between those companies where, you know, the reverse can happen where AEW sends over their talents, like a Nick Wayne, perhaps, to Japan for him to get more experience. But yeah, like that does seem to be what AEW is doing right now, trying to build as many relationships as they can to really not only just plan out for the currents with like the Forbidden Door show, but also just for the future as well, to keep their options open. And yeah, like you said, Adam, the Nick Wayne thing is very interesting that they signed him right away to seemingly I don't want to say no competition, but it does seem like a bold move to really sign this kid who I doubt WWE would have their sights on him. It doesn't really seem like the kind of the person that they would want, especially like he is an indie wrestler and they don't really seem interested in signing indie wrestlers. And so you're just really competing with Impact and NWA, which, you know, quite frankly, aren't really competitions to AEW in terms of signing talents. You know, quite, you know, they sometimes bring them over regardless, you know, just by building their own relationships. And so it is interesting that they decided to give this kid a contract in hopes that he could be a future star for them.
But are you going to vote for Takeshita for Rookie of the Year, Jason?
I mean, that's a hot debate. So that's probably for another podcast.
Okay.
He's gonna, yeah, noted rookie. Gonna skate the.
Yeah.
The funny thing about the Takeshita as a rookie thing is that he was on AEW television last year.
Yeah, he was
there. So it's not like he's just the first time there. So it's, even if you want to go through the absurdist argument of, well, he's eligible because he's never appeared on national television before. It's not even true. He was on national television last year. But I think, yeah, with the AEW's talent development, I think you're right, Adam, at pointing out like special projects, right? Which are a physical profile picture people. And that's WWE's kind of philosophy, which is like, if another place was just training a bunch of ex-college football players all of the time, I think WWE would be happy to raid them in a lot of ways. But they felt like that's not happening. So we need to do it ourselves, which is led to the kind of performance center that they end up having. Now, with AEW, it's more of a sense of they wanted Jade for, well, I'll start with Satnam Singh. They wanted Satnam Singh for a very specific reason, which is that he has some level of fame in India, and so they felt like they could push him in a way that WWE pushed Great Khali. And as much as it was as easy as it was to kind of like mock Great Khali and WWE pushing this guy, he was like a huge success in helping establish India as a really key market to WWE. And so there's a logic to wanting to use Satnam Singh. So they felt like there was a good reason to kind of go through the paces of developing him as a talent and trying to get him to be a wrestling star. Jade Cargill, similar thing in the sense that she fit a physical profile, and they wanted to say, how can we convert this person into being a wrestler? Because we think that she's going to be very marketable because she has this look that's going to get people to watch when they see her on screen. They've done, I think, like less outside of those two examples. Like, can't really think of any more off the top of my head that they've done. You also have the second generation wrestlers, and you know, these people are being trained. I believe all four of those people are trained by QT Marshall in the Nightmare Factory. And that was one of those things, which was when Cody was involved with AEW, it felt like Cody in the Nightmare Factory and Dustin Rhodes and QT, and they were producing these little YouTube shows with talent that were training with them. It almost felt like AEW was on its way to developing its own performance center and its own kind of version of NXT, which was the Nightmare Factory, and that Cody was going to run this school, and Dustin, who's a very respected veteran wrestler, and QT, who's already an accomplished trainer, are going to run this wrestling school, and anyone that we want to develop, they can go here. I don't know if that relationship is still going to be as tight with Cody no longer in the picture. I think it's been kind of inconsistent as far as what Cody has said when it comes to what's going to happen with the Nightmare Factory. But I wonder if they try to maybe either formalize that a little bit more. Maybe it's a different school. Maybe Dustin Rhodes starts his own school, or someone else associated with AEW starts their own school. But I do wonder if we see them kind of open up the doors a little bit more formally and say, yes, this is going to be maybe not our performance center, but maybe something more akin to like the WCW power plant, this is AEW's, where AEW is going to train special projects, as opposed to, go looking for the indies to find and hope that they come up with somebody who we feel like we need.
Yeah, I think Dustin Rhodes might actually have his own school already. Yeah, I think he might. But I mean, I don't know if the schools necessarily need to be formally affiliated. Like, I mean, Seth Rollins, he has his own school, and people, from there go out everywhere. So I don't know. I think AEW might still get people from the Nightmare Factory, even though Cody's in, WWE, because I don't think Seth cares if like his students like go work for TNA or Impact, or TNA over the years.
Well, WWE is not going to want Cody's students.
Well, that's probably that's part of it. That's probably part of it too. Like Cody wouldn't care if they go somewhere else if WWE doesn't want them. Yeah, I don't know. One thing that's interesting about Satnam and Jade is that because AEW has fewer special projects like that where people with no experience, they get to work with all kinds of people who are a lot more experienced than them, which gives those special projects a greater chance of success, as opposed to, like, imagine if Satnam Singh was training in WWE and he had to work with like Veer and Omos, or
or he's working with 100 other people with very little experience.
Yeah, exactly. He's working with the NXT 2.0 crew, or like if Jade was working with the NXT, like Jade's having matches with Lash Legend. Like that's not gonna turn out as well. So I don't think AEW is ever going to develop their own performance center type thing or have any sort of formal relationship with one school unless WWE changes their strategy and starts like signing indie wrestlers again, because right now they basically have the vast majority of the indies to themselves. Like WWE they'll sign, like if they have a class of like 10 or 20 people, maybe they'll have 3 or 4, people from the indies that have some level of experience that they'll sign. Usually they are signing people really early, like right after training, if they fit their physical profiles for both men and women, and their age profiles.
You mentioned that like the people who wouldn't hit the 50 matches on Cage Match would be signed. So maybe they aren't officially trained by WWE, but they functionally kind of develop under their umbrella. And you're right, if it's the physical profile, they'll be interested in bringing in those people. And like for the right kind of person, like they got Roxanne Perez, Roxy from Ring of Honor, and she was I don't know, she might not even been at 50 matches on Cage Match, but she was a known independent wrestler that probably, I imagine, AEW was very interested in bringing in, and that was a competitive move, and that was kind of done after the shift in policy.
Yeah, so like WWE, they're still, with their current talent strategy, they're still bringing in some indie wrestlers, but a lot. Because when I was writing that, I was looking at their recent classes, and so like there might have been a couple that had 50 matches. It's very few, but they are signing people that like came out of training and maybe they've had like 10 matches, or maybe they just got out of training and they've like haven't worked at all, but they're still bringing them in like right after that because they fit their age and physical profile. But in general, like AEW, they have the indies in terms of the experienced people that will be able to contribute in the near future. Like they have that all to themselves right now. And I think probably because of that, I don't see them like going, if they're not even doing house shows because of the expense, I find it hard to believe they're going to like establish their own power plant. or anything like that. And they don't, with the size of their roster and the amount of TV they have right now, they don't really need to make sure like they have a bunch of replacements available. I do think Tony is, it seems like he's signing more people for Ring of Honor. So he does kind of want, just because of his booking strategy, which is to protect all the stars and not have them work as often. If you're going to do that, then you need like a wide variety of like 50-50 people that you can put on TV to feed to them. So I think in general, they're always going to have like a relatively large roster for the amount of television time and content that they're producing. But again, until like WWE starts going after the indies again and really challenges them for like all the best available talent that they would perceive to be the best available talent, I think they'll probably just keep their current strategy as is. I think it would have to be a change in WWE's recruitment strategy that then necessitates AEW adapting and adopting something similar.
Yeah, it feels like I agree that there probably won't be a formal school or like a power plant performance center kind of thing. I just think it's more like, hey, Dustin, does anyone, we need someone for a match? Is anyone in your school ready for, be out for a match? And, I think Matt Seidel's got a school. Sean Spears, he co-runs a school with Tyler Breeze, I believe. And so like there's plenty of people on the roster who run their own schools. And so I think it's just more like a favor kind of a deal where like, hey, we need someone for a match. We'll bring one of your students in.
The funny thing about that is that's how WWF used to do it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Back in the 80s, they're talking to Dominic DeNucci and bringing in Mick Foley so he can get his head knocked off by Dynamite Kid.
Yeah, exactly. I like you said before, like it really is that sort of old school approach that I think that they're very comfortable with right now. Unless, like you said, WWE just dramatically changes their strategy, which doesn't really seem to be the case anytime soon.
So I wanted to kind of switch one last thing before we wrap up. Is kind of talk about some other wrestling outside of WWE and AEW, and particularly kind of New Japan. And I was talking a little bit this with Mike Spears earlier this week, because we're talking about actually not New Japan, but Dragon Gate is sending some talent over on excursion. Like they're sending SB Kento. He's going to be based in America for a little bit. And then I think La Estrella is also coming over. And we were kind of talking about like, is SB Gento kind of like too good to go on excursion? Like he's like too important to their company at the moment. He's too popular of a wrestler. He's kind of evolved quickly enough past the need to go on an excursion. And we kind of talked about how important are excursions right now for Japanese talent? Something for the most part unique to Japan. You don't see a ton of American wrestlers going on excursions. I think that's something that I think we would all kind of like AEW to at least attempt. Just from an interest standpoint, it'd be kind of cool to see some of the, maybe underdeveloped AEW talent, maybe someone like Lee Johnson kind of go and be like a lower mid card guy in a promotion, maybe in Japan or maybe on the UK or something like that. And kind of like, but is an excursion really necessary to someone becoming a star? And how many times have we seen people go on excursions and it doesn't really work out? I think like Master Wato for New Japan is an interesting example of a guy who I think people were really high on as a young lion. Then he went to Mexico, didn't really do a ton in CMLL, and then he came back and he was Master Wato. And it just kind of feels like he's pegged no longer as a top future star, but as a kind of like a mid-card junior heavyweight. And I'm thinking, just kind of curious to know like how I think a lot of people idealize Japanese wrestling's talent development. I think part of it is the dojo system, and a part of it, and especially with like Joshi wrestling, so much of that talent is developed in-house, and so much of it ends up being really good right away. But I do wonder if we see some changes coming on in the future. At New Japan Pro Wrestling's kind of like, they had like this, they called it like a business strategy presentation earlier this month. Their president Ohbari was kind of talking about New Japan's business strategy, and he went over a lot of figures. But one of the things he talked about was kind of like the young lion and the dojo system, and kind of, is this kind of antiquated? Is this kind of outdated? and he said, I have his quote here, and he says, most wrestlers won't be able to wrestle until 65, and they're coming from college at 22 to then start again from scratch in the dojo. We have to make changes here, Ohbari stated, before suggesting we can have wrestlers a part of New Japan Pro Wrestling and training while they're still in college, for one example. And since wrestlers retire young, we have to support and provide a path for a second career for our wrestlers after they leave the ring behind. That's the only way to make wrestling a more attractive career path for young athletes. So he's kind of stressing that wrestling is not as interesting for young people as it once was, and that they have to be more aggressive in how they're recruiting people and how they're attaining them. He also goes on and talks a lot about how, he talks about Stardom's talent development, and he wonders, do we still need to be doing things like putting the Young Lions out in black tights and black trunks and giving them making sure they don't have personalities, making sure that they only do the most basic of wrestling moves. And I think for certain fans, it's kind of, because it's so different than American wrestling, we really appreciate that kind of approach to talent development. But I do think it's reasonable to look at New Japan's recent talent development and think of whether or not that is actually as good of a strategy as it seems to be. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that, but I thought it was a really interesting piece about kind of looking at a fundamental aspect of New Japan Pro Wrestling and potentially changing that. And what does that mean for the rest of pro wrestling?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. A part of that's being, I think, just necessitated by like, hey, they have an aging roster. Okada's not as young as he used to be. Time moves fast. And honestly, a lot of their top guys are not people that went through their system now, which is also kind of interesting.
It's like WWE almost.
Yeah, that's so I don't know if that necessary. So their classes of people and how many people they train at once, it's the polar opposite from WWE's Performance Center. The Performance Center, they're just filtering countless bodies through there and cutting like so many people whose names we don't even know. With New Japan, I mean, their classes are so much smaller. Like everyone starts at the same time. They train together for years and years before they're even given any sort of personality or go out on excursion and then come back with some sort of character. So if you just happen to get like a couple of bad classes in a row, then it's like, oh no, like we're in trouble now. So I don't know if that probably has something to do with it. Maybe they just had some bad luck. I think the Young Lion approach in general makes some sense. It's like you're going to drill the basics over and over and over again. Make sure you're proficient in those first before you start trying like more higher risk moves or start becoming like unique and developing into a character. So I can see them speeding up the timeline on that a little bit because it probably is a little bit excessive in terms of how long they have these guys stay at the Young Lion level. I think the excursions are important, not necessarily well for one, it's important because it does give them exposure to how wrestling is done in a different part of the world. So when they come back, they have like some skills that might be unique for where they worked outside of New Japan in particular. But more importantly, it just basically erases the fan's memory that, oh yeah, this was a Young Lion guy that was losing all the time, and now he's like some character that I'm supposed to believe can, beat Tanahashi or Jay White or Will Ospreay, something like that. So I think that's kind of the primary purpose of the excursions. It's a little bit talent development, but it's more so, all right, we need to get the fans to not think about this guy the same way they did before, and the best way to do that is just to have him go away for a year and then come back. So I could see them, I think probably just accelerating that timeline would be best. If they allow them to do characters before, maybe that could work all right, but I don't know like what the problem I see with that though would be like, if all of a sudden this Young Lion is this new character like next week, are the fans really going to buy that, or do they really need that time away for the excursion to really buy that there's been some sort of character change or skill level change in the wrestler to view them as a competitive star?
Yeah, that's why I kind of think that the US LA Dojo Young Lions are going to be a good litmus test to the whole system, because I do think that, they are trying to branch out, like you said, Adam. Like the classes are getting pretty small in terms of the Japanese dojo. Like there's only like 2 Young Lions right now working matches. And so, it's very different than like before, where you had like, a good handful, like 4 or 5 at a time back in the day. But you have this LA Dojo class with, I think Carl Fredericks is probably the leader of that, him winning the Young Lion Cup.
He
They
was.
clearly, yeah, he definitely was. Yeah. But yeah, obviously, there's some interesting things going on with them now. Especially with the vagueness of them actually graduating from Young Lion, from being a Young Lion. That was very vague for them. And, they've been working the indies and such there. Obviously, of course, the pandemic and lack of travel hurts as well. But it's going to be interesting to see where those guys go in terms of their future careers, whether, they are actually going to be pushed as big stars.
Yeah, the vagueness that you pointed out, like, okay, they're a Young Lion, now they're not a Young Lion. That's what's concerning to me about possibly like doing away with excursions, is that there has to be some sort of line of demarcation or some sort of reason that fans believe like, okay, this is a different person now. Like one of the reasons, like this is going back a long time ago, but like one of the reasons like I lost interest in SmackDown was because Bradshaw went from random mid-card guy to main event JBL character overnight without anything explaining that at all. And he didn't draw particularly well either that year. So there's kind of an example of like, okay, there needs to be like some space in between Young Lion versus like new character. And their excursion doesn't even have to be good because no one really pays attention to it. Like Okada is the best example of that. His excursion was horrible, but he came back and his new character was, and obviously he's super talented. So maybe that's not the best example, but it didn't matter how bad his excursion was just because his new character was great and he was great.
Yeah, I do think if you're, and Ohbari kind of gets into this when he brings up Stardom, but you look at New Japan Pro Wrestling's talent development, it's super, super traditional, which I think a lot of people like that idea of it being traditional. And it's like you said, the class comes in and they spend years training and they ground down these fundamentals and they wear the traditional black boots, black trunks, only basically do wrestling moves that you would have seen in like 1972 when the company was founded. And it's kept so basic and original to the company's formation. And then, but you do look at some of the alternative wrestling companies that have popped up in Japan since New Japan was founded. And two of them I think are really obvious are Stardom and Dragon Gate. And you look at how they've developed talent. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that, especially Dragon Gate. Dragon Gate, they develop talent very quickly. They give them personas on television on when they start wrestling. They have personas. They're not all just wearing black trunks and black boots. They'll have the wacky Dragon Gate names and things like that, and they'll push them right away. Shun Skywalker was only wrestling for a few years kind of in front of crowds before he got pushed as a top guy in Dragon Gate, and talked about SB Kento kind of overstepping the necessary excursion phase. But I think you look at that, and if you're New Japan, you're like, how come we can't develop talent at that rate? There's no reason why you can't. You have more resources than Dragon Gate. You have good trainers. It's not like the guys stink when they need forever to get better. It's more of this, maybe we're looking at this the wrong way, and maybe our philosophy is outdated. And I think a lot of people are like, when Ohbari said those comments at the presser earlier this month, I think a lot of people were like, really, he's going to change this fundamental aspect, or he's talking about changing this really fundamental aspect, one of the things that makes New Japan. And it's like, if you look at the results of other people who are trying to develop talent, they seem to be way more efficient at it than New Japan, at least, especially when it comes to pace and being able to speed up people into taking them from trainee to potential top star.
Yeah, I think the case is, and that's what stood out to me with those comments, is that he was talking about training people earlier while they were still in college, while they were still in school. And so maybe they're not full-time because they're still going to school, but basically getting them into the system earlier so they can learn quicker, and then maybe shortening the Young Lion period as well. Maybe they eliminate it entirely and they do give people gimmicks off the bat. I think it probably does. It's obviously a much tougher sell to like someone who might be considering becoming a wrestler. It's like, yep, we wait until you're out of school and then you're going to spend multiple years training and being a young lion. Then you'll go someplace where you might not really want to live for a year, and then you'll come back and be a star. So it's like, okay, you're putting in like a 4 or 5 year investment before, really even having the potential to, become a star or earn a lot of money. And if you're doing that after you get out of school, you're in your late 20s at that point. And so if it doesn't work out, which, it doesn't always, or maybe someone gets hurt or something, it's like, okay, well, then what are they going to do? And from a company investment standpoint too, like, if someone isn't really starting until their late 20s to earn you money, then that's more of an investment on your end. And it's not like WWE where they can, they just cut people if they don't show any improvement after a month. You're putting in years of investment in these people and hoping you get a payoff much later. So I can understand the thought process of, hey, we got to figure out a way to speed this up, especially since, we've had a couple classes that maybe haven't produced a lot of results.
And I think, when it comes to, he did make a big deal about like the age thing. I mean, as a fan, I don't really get the impression that New Japan, like all these young lions are too old, or like these people that are popping up are all like, these new wrestlers are like 35 or 40 years old. That's not the impression that I got. I never really had a problem with I never really thought like we need more people who are 19 or 20 years old and less people that are like 27 or 28. I don't really see that as big of an issue. It was, I think the pacing of how long it takes them to get elevated, I think, it can be improved. And I think it does kind of, a lot of times can create like this backlog of talent where you kind of have, your brand new young lion class guys who have only, been wrestling for like a month or two on television or, in front of arenas, in front of crowds. And then you have like your other young lion course. It's like, guys are like a year in and they're kind of ready for excursion, but not quite right. Then you have the guys that are on excursion. Then you have the guys coming back from excursion, but haven't really been pushed as top guys yet. And it's like, you got this whole like kind of block of like, 15 talents and they're all at kind of various stages of young lion having not established themselves. And it kind of creates this backlog of people where it's like you have people like Aaron Hanare who have been there for years and years and years, or David Finlay who have been there for like a decade almost. And they're in their first G1, like they're finally kind of getting a chance to establish themselves as like relevant wrestlers, and they've been there 10 years. That to me needs to be improved, not necessarily like an age line of talent.
Yeah, I think, well, the thought process with that too would be, if we can make people stars earlier, or at least people that are on the roster earlier, then that means we get more years of revenue generation from them, as opposed to like, are we unnecessarily extending their time period where they're not making us any money and we're actually, spending money on their development? So I could see that definitely being part of the thought process. I think we have some sample size issues in terms of their approach though, like whether it's still working or whether there is something that's systemically wrong with it, just because they don't have as many people in their training program. So it's the same thing that I was kind of talking about earlier. Like a lot of pro wrestling recruits, no matter how good the training program is, they're just not going to be very good anyway. So, and even, with someone like David Finlay, who's, he's pretty good and he's just making it to the G1 now. I don't know if necessarily he should have been in the G1 earlier, based on his ability level and what he had demonstrated. So sometimes people just aren't going to be very good. But when you have smaller sample sizes, obviously it is more concerning. Like, hey, we have to change something to get some more people quicker.
Yeah, I think it could just easily be a perceived pressure on New Japan's parts that they feel, of AEW growing and, like Jesse said, Dragon Gate and Stardom, they seem to be, doing something that we aren't. And so maybe we have a problem, but it could easily just be a perceived problem that, like you said, Adam, it's just a small sample size that we don't really know if there's actually is a problem or not. And, I guess maybe they just want a marketing kind of a thing where like they just want to market a younger star rather than this late 20s star. I was looking at ages like Great O'Khan, like he's 31 now, and when he came back from excursion, he was 29. And so, but Jay White seems to be the counter example to that. I think when he came back, he was like in his like mid 20s, like 24, 25. But still, like they probably want to market a 19-year-old star like an SB Kento. And like, hey, we want that kind of guy, and we need to change something to get an SB Kento type to market.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different things. I think one is they just they need younger talent because people are aging out. For Jesse's point, they see proof of concept from other promotions that are like recruiting people and pushing them younger, and it's working. They are able to develop faster. And then also just in terms of recruitment, maybe there is some, obviously they're like by far the #1 promotion in Japan, but maybe there is some concern about like, hey, maybe we're not quite as appealing to like, maybe there's some talent we could be able to recruit, but they might choose other places just because they'll have opportunities to become a star quicker. And so, you know, having them train while they're in school, shortening the young lion period, you know, something like that could just make them more appealing to potential recruits.
And a lot of people will tell you that they're very restrictive on who can be a recruit, and they have height limits, and they have weight limits, and they have this kind of barrier, physical characteristics you have to hit. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons Dragon Gate has been able to get so much talent and develop it, is because they're picking up people that have New Japan. I don't know how many of Dragon Gate's talent have been people that like applied for the New Japan dojo and got turned down because they were too small. But the idea is that Dragon Gate is also more attractive if you're small, because you can be pushed as a top guy there, and you really can't, with very, very few exceptions, in New Japan, because they kind of, again, this is kind of like an outdated perspective, which is like, you need to be big to draw money. And you know, we want you to be over 6 feet tall, and there's not going to be the same amount of talent, especially in Japan, as there to kind of to fill in that role and be good. Because the percentage of, like you said, the percentage of wrestling trainees who are actually really good is going to be very small, even with great training. And when you reduce the people that are interested in it to people of a certain size, you're shortening your sample. That's gonna be it. I'm gonna stop us here because we're running up against the time. But Adam, what do you want to tell us about? You want to plug anything? You want to tell us where to find your work?
Yeah, you can find my work on Voices of Wrestling. Search Adam Berger. I've got a couple columns up there. Some of them I'm pretty proud of. I have one that was pretty fun, where I went to a Control Your Narrative show in Orlando back on Revolution.
You were the only
weekend.
person there.
there weren't a lot of us. It was an experience. I don't want to spoil it or what my takeaways were, because I think it's fun. I'll just say it wasn't what I was expecting. And yeah, it's the concern over it. At least I don't know if they've changed since then, but when I actually saw the show, all the concern over it, like I thought it ended up being pretty funny. So I'll plug that. Yeah, and I'm working right now. I'll have another column up soon. I'm already working on it. It's trying to answer the question. For AEW, they get criticized a lot with, they have too much WWE talent, and they get compared to TNA. Most of you are like, they're repeating the same mistakes TNA did. So I'm taking a look at, okay, what actually is too much WWE talent, and are they repeating the mistakes of TNA, or are people really just not remembering exactly what TNA actually did?
All right, well, excellent. Well, we appreciate you coming on. Hopefully people enjoyed this episode, and Jason and I will be back shortly, and we will see everyone next time.